Welcome to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, a show dedicated to cybersecurity challenges, solutions, a journey together, not alone. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of MSP 1337. This is episode 191, in case you were wondering how long this has been going on. And today I have Jim Harryman of Kinetic Technology Group back on the show. Jim, welcome to the show.
Good to be back.
I think you've been on close to like 50 of the
I
episodes.
don't think it's been that many, but
Okay.
but
Uh, it's been a few, and I thought it was fitting to have you on for this particular episode as we're seeing a pattern emerge of CompTIA members who are pursuing the Trustmark, reaching the point in their journey where they've achieved the Trustmark. And you've been on the show before where we've talked about audits, preparing for SOC 2, preparing for the Trustmark or CIS, and what it looks like, and how to gather evidence, and some other things. And what we haven't ever talked about, because it hadn't happened yet, is what does it look like to have achieved the Trustmark, knowing that it's not so much a destination as it is a sort of like a turning, a shift, or you braked for the stop sign, right? Like, maybe don't come to a complete stop, because we don't want that either. But share with me I get the journey. I think those that are listening to the show, we get the journey, right? It's not easy. It's often the lift is often tied to things that we didn't plan on, like, whoa, yeah, we've got policies maybe, or we've got, good process and procedures that are documented around these things. And then you start digging into a safeguard that's asking a very specific set of questions, or a question, and you're like, well, we're doing part of that. And now you're realizing, like, okay, what we thought was a lift that we were already doing is now a new lift that you weren't planning on. So you've made it through that. So here we are the month of June. I think you started your audit around the beginning of June. What did that look like, and where did it feel like, oh man, I feel like I'm just gonna have to do so much more than I ever anticipated?
well, honestly, I never felt that way because having been through a few audits before, as we discussed, I wanted to put something back onto the folks that were going to be assessing us and reviewing us. And so, if there wasn't a specific ask, I didn't put it in there. I'm like, well, if
Right.
it's not specific, then even if it's just an example of, a piece of evidence, I'm like, well, ask me what you really want. So,
Yeah.
I took that approach, and for better or for worse, I feel like it's been enlightening to me in some ways because it showed me areas of definite improvement needed, for one. It validated things that we'd been working on for years, which was great. And confirmed the fact that I knew that this was just going to be an ongoing process for us. It's not something that we're like, woohoo, we're done, and
Right.
and jumping into it with that approach, or jumping into it with the idea that I have to get everything done before I hit the submit button, is just the wrong way of thinking. I mean, the document what you do, and if you feel like there are things that you should lift now prior to going that route, then certainly do it. But the whole goal is for continued improvement, right? And
Yeah.
so we're never going to be 100% ever. It's just never going to happen. No organization in the world is 100% in any of these things. And so all we can do is strive to continually be better and take on the things and prioritize them in such a way that have the largest impact at the lowest cost, not whether that's financial or team resources or whatever the case may be, to really prioritize it in that way. And that's kind of the approach that we took.
I think you bring up a good point with regards to, how you go about the areas that you have gaps, right? So like whatever the safeguard is that you aren't doing or maybe aren't doing to the level that you should be. Maybe that's through observation of an auditor making recommendations or just your own self-realization that we need to improve upon this. And so then you factor in the things like you described. How about how does this impact us financially? How does this impact us from a resource standpoint? And does doing this safeguard put us in a contrast or at butting heads with our goals as an organization? Because there's definitely some safeguards in there that I've seen that are like, well, we don't want to go too far in that one direction because now we're alienating or reducing the impact that we can have if that wasn't so tight on the way we lock things down. Now, granted, that's probably, especially with the trust mark, I think that's not as common because a lot of the safeguards are not geared to put sort of like constraints in. This isn't about bumpers in a bowling, for bowling where we're just wanting to ensure you can bowl a strike every time. But something that comes to mind that goes beyond that, like you've made these decisions, it makes me think of something that you hear commonly talked about for those that are pursuing CMMC, and that's the POAM. And for those listening, if you don't know, it's plan of action and milestones. And one could argue that that's what we call projects. Um, but in this plan of action and milestones, because this is built differently, this is about we believe at CompTIA and for those doing the audits that this is something that's going to take you 90 days plus. If it's inside of 90 days, we just want to hear that those are things that you're working on. You plan to get them done in a short timeline. But getting into the POAM side of things, as you went through the trust mark, where did you land? Where did it feel like the most effort is going to be as you prepare for the audit, 12 months from now?
Um, it's going to be mostly on the administrative side, I believe. Revamping some policies to line up with everything a little more appropriately than they did when I submitted them.
Sure.
And like we discussed, it's not like there's anything just so out of whack that it's indiscernible, right? But there's some clarity that needs to be brought into to our policies and some clear uh, consistency across the board with them that need to be better defined, I believe. And so that's going to be probably the biggest lift for us, is just going through. I mean, we have some policies that are really, really good and strong, but we definitely have some that were, when initially written, were really process-based policies, right? I mean, we took a process and we made it a policy just so that we could say that we technically had a policy, and it
Sure.
wasn't. I mean, there's still a policy, but there's just way too much information in some of them that need to be redacted out of the policy itself, and then either referenced in some way or something along those lines. And then we have a couple of spots where we didn't have specific policies in place that we are going to have to write and implement as part of our POAM. So that to say, if you don't have a policy, it doesn't mean you have to write it right now either. And
Right.
that's the cool thing. And that would be that way within, I wouldn't say any audit
Yeah.
necessarily. SOC 2 has some specific things called out that you have to have prior to getting it. And then everything else, they write down as exceptions that they want you to improve on before the next time. And to the trust mark, that's the POAM. That's going to be
Right.
the exceptions. These are the things that we found you're gonna need to do. I don't feel like there's going to be any real financial area that we need to dive into yet. I think honestly, the biggest thing I've seen in any of the frameworks is when they start getting into DLP and data loss prevention, and that's probably going to be one of the biggest, heaviest financial lifts for anybody in our industry specifically that doesn't really do that. I mean, obviously, like Microsoft has implemented DLP to a certain degree. Google has implemented DLP to a certain degree. If you're using some type of, email filtering, there's some DLP built into that too. But taking it all the way, like if
Yeah.
you really dig into it, down to the endpoint and, seeing if something gets copied off to a USB drive or something, I mean, that gets pretty expensive. So
It
those,
sure can.
yeah, absolutely.
I think that kind of covers some of the arguments you hear from a lot of participants, not necessarily in the trust mark, but going through frameworks wanting to improve or align with a set of standards. And you see things where, the assumption is, well, that product or service costs too much, so therefore I'm going to do nothing. And the reality, and I think even when I had my MSP, I was guilty of it too. I wanted the next best thing. Like if the product could do more and better, and it was easier to configure, and it was shinier, and all the polish was on it, and it made it look good, then I wanted to go there. But the reality is, when we're talking about cybersecurity, is in many cases, okay is actually great, because previously you did not have okay. You had the hope and a prayer, right? Like, well, if we're not monitoring it, then we don't have to remediate it. And like, well, it's not really a good look. And we've talked about this before, right? We talked about, like, what do you do with event and alert logs? How often should you look at them? Trustmark, CIS, they say, you should be looking at them at least weekly, if not more frequently. And you hear well, we don't have the bandwidth to do that. Well, why not? Like, I mean, but what's the priority? Because we know the dangers that occur that are reflecting what's happening in your organization come through those doors, right? Like if you're monitoring what's coming through that door, you get the little bell chime every time the door opens, somebody came in. And I think that's the scare here is FTE is where the biggest hit's going to come from when you implement any of these new, any safeguard that you haven't previously implemented is going to primarily be on your internal resources. And so the loaded question has to be, what makes more sense? Do I engage third party to help manage this, or do I have the resources that won't be overly burdened to do this with what I already have? And I think that's how you must go about making decisions around tools and services anyways, right? Because yep, we're going to buy that, and then, well, what's the impact?
Yeah, without a doubt. And look, one of the things that, and this kind of gets completely off on a different tangent, but if you have really worked to streamline your operations and you have KPIs in place to continually meet your goals operationally speaking, you will find the time. It exists. If you can't find the time, then find out what is wasting your staff's time,
Yeah,
right? And address those things, because I feel like that's one of the things that set us up for success going through these types of audits the last 5 years, is that we worked really hard for like a decade on operational maturity, right? I mean, it
right.
was it was at the cost of financial success and profitability. Um, Lining out our operational maturity helped us find the time to um, put resources on the items that we needed. It's not to say that we still, struggle to carve out the time that we need, particularly on the policy side. Anything administrative,
Yeah,
Kinetic is going to, go to the bottom of the list because none of us are that way. But when the rubber meets the road, and that's why, to me, going through something like the trust mark is so important, is that there's a level of accountability involved where we are being held accountable to it. I mean, obviously, we can say, forget this. I'm not going to do this and whatever. But what good is that doing you?
right.
I mean, if you're not being held accountable to a set of standards by a third party, then things just aren't really ever going to get done. I mean, at least that was my case. I'm not going to say it's
Yeah.
that for everybody, but I know how I am, and without the accountability in place, it it just wouldn't. And so that's why it's important to our organization for that.
Well, I mean, to some extent, one can argue that the reason why you go get your eyes examined every year is because you want to make sure that there isn't something potentially wrong with your eyes. The Trustmark or any framework that you're being audited against is a place and time to be checked that you are still meeting said safeguards. What I think makes a big difference between what other frameworks are doing versus the Trustmark is the goal isn't to pass at the point in time. The goal is to show continuous improvement over time. And I think that's a big difference between uh the goals that we set, right? Because anybody can pass a test at some point if they've done enough prep to prepare for the exam. But usually after you're done preparing for an exam and you've taken the test, then you are not focused on that anymore. Like it's like, oh, we got that done, got an A, moving on to the next thing, and you forget about it, right? And then 12 months have gone by, and you're like, oh shoot, we've got to prepare for this test again. And I saw this with other frameworks, right? Like I've been through a few SOC audits, and I always remembered like probably about 45 to 90 days prior to the next audit. We were going back through and making sure that we had updated the evidence for the different things that needed the reports or whatever it was. And we started noticing like, wait a second, we're doing this almost to check the boxes off versus making sure that as an organization, we're just showing more of an improved approach to being ready for that rather than having to go and hunt down and collect some, new screenshots from, that happened inside of the last 12 months.
For
So
sure.
I
Yeah,
think that's
this morning I had a meeting with our security team, and I was telling them that, here over the next week or so, we're going to be getting our POAM from the Trustmark, and based on that, we'll be lining up all the things that we all have to do collectively or individually for that. And I told them, I'm like, here's the deal. I mean, yes, we have all these, in our meeting minutes that we do these things and everything else. And I said, but we're going to start expanding that. And we're going to start every time we do this, there's going to be, not just the meeting minutes, but we're also going to have some other supporting documents that we're going to start collecting as we go through the process. I mean, we've been doing this long enough
yeah,
now where that should really be a relatively easy thing for us to do. It's not easy in the beginning. I mean, it is, like you said, it's like, okay, oh crap, we got to do all this stuff. But if SOC 2, you got type 1, type 2, point in time or over a space of time. And they're not, that's something that you have to do. You can't, I mean, I guess you could, but it's unwise to, falsify evidence for an audit.
for a
So
number of reasons.
right. I mean, you just don't want to do that. And so they're going to want to see, screenshots and times and dates, and that they are lining up. If they see something with a screenshot that has one date, but the date on the document is newer than the date that shows, I mean, it's pretty obvious stuff. So but that's really, to me, kind of one of the next phases for us is being there. We got a little lax on it between our last SOC 2 audit, because we were going to go to a type 2 and then opted to get the Trustmark instead.
Sure.
And it's not to say that we won't try to achieve the type 2 again down the road. That really is just going to depend on whether or not we get a demand for that type of something from a client or a prospect or something like that.
Sure.
But
Well,
um,
hopefully the trust mark will satisfy in lieu of, but
I believe it will. And even before, when we had the SOC 2 active, we never really called out SOC 2. We just said that we were independently audited by a third party. and
Sure.
that usually is sufficient.
Which is
And
funny because most frameworks actually have language that say you should be regularly assessed by a third party.
sure.
So it's in the Trustmark. I think it pulls the one from ISO that basically says you should be assessed by a third party. So I'll be interested to sort of keep track on your progress as you guys are, entering into the stage of working through the poem. The poem isn't all of it, right? So there's still the entire trust mark, areas that you may have been at the what we would call doesn't necessarily need improvement, but how do you got to continue to maintain it, right? You got to continue to make sure that it's staying at the level that your organization is comfortable with. Some might say like, oh, well, it needs to be on all systems. I would question the quality of that statement on some of the safeguards that are in there because that might just be a little bit extreme. But as you're working through this, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that this is largely an impact to business and administrative task, not the impact on your engineers and the technical side of things. Because really, as you went through this journey and you did it before with SOC 2 and I would question then is this about your staff recognizing that the poem is just part of like getting everybody rowing in the right direction. Those are the big items that were just not where they needed to be. But are you seeing where your staff is saying, look, where are we at, Jim? Across the board, we did well in these areas. It's not like you had 177 poem items.
Right.
So how has that conversation gone? You had the security conversation. What's the biggest fear now as you leap into the poem side and recognizing that a lot of this is going to be around documentation, policy, how people interpret what's in those policies.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of the challenge. And I think as our leadership meets to really review the policies and start to rework them as needed, we will be looking at how it impacts the rest of the staff and their daily stuff. And look, we've had challenges on the resource side as we have adopted a lot of these things. I mean, just last week alone, especially as we've started to roll these assessments downhill into our clients, right? I mean,
Sure.
that's when the real heavy lifting starts to happen, as you start doing it for not just one company, but you're trying
Right.
for 100 or
But I,
however.
but I think that's part of why we do this, right? Like, because the reality is, you as an MSP, your primary function isn't how to serve your internal IT department or your internal staff. That's not how we got started in the MSP space. It was to provide services to those that couldn't do it themselves. And we largely relied on our own internal staff to do the things on their own systems that you're getting paid to do on client systems. So I think, and it's my hope here is that as we work towards a client profile, that the big takeaway is what is really on the responsibility for the client as they are working towards satisfying a trust mark, and how does the MSP have to be involved in that for that to be successful? Like, I don't think it's your responsibility to define their acceptable use policy, but I would argue that or not change management, that might be one they should be able to do, but things like vulnerability management or EDR type stuff, they are very much relying on you to make that a reality, or you wouldn't be in the room with them. And how well are those things actually being tracked, documented, and truly clearly implemented, where it's not just you saying we provide these services to the client. The client is saying we know these services are being deployed and we have the reports and the evidence to support that. Because I don't know about you, but I don't know how many times we would have scenarios where we're like, oh, yeah, we do firewall management for that client. And you realize like there hasn't been a firmware update done on that particular firewall in 2 years because it was one that got missed.
And it continued to work just fine. So,
Exactly. But
you don't know
again,
what you don't know.
well, and that goes back in time to when, the exploitation of vulnerable environments, I think, was far less targeted than it is today for damage to self and clients. So you don't know what you don't know. I think that pretty much sums up where we're at. So, any piece of advice for anybody that's still working towards their Trustmark audit, or is looking at doing an audit through any of the other frameworks?
I would just encourage them to just keep pressing on, and if they're struggling with time and all those other things, it's really focus on identifying why you don't have time to what I would consider, and what I believe CompTIA or any auditing body would consider, time to run your business, to
Sure,
actually run your business. And because that's what this is ultimately, it's all about. I mean, it's not just about MSPs and the space that we're in, but it's like so many of us started a company because we were good at something and didn't really understand jack squat about running a business.
sure.
And this is, if you're going to be in business, learn to run a business. And this is part of the
We all
process.
started there.
We did.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate your time as always, and this has been an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks, and have a great week.